Thank you all very much indeed. Good morning, everyone. And I don't know if that group I was talking to at the reception last night have made it. Are you here? Don't see their hands. I know, we've all faced that choice between the 9 o'clock keynote and an hour or so more in bed. The thought did run through my mind, but I realized pretty rapidly that I didn't have much choice. So I'm here this morning to talk about innovation, excellence, and diversity. How can regulation help? That's not meant to be an ironic comment. We are going to try and look seriously at the contribution that regulators can make to the pursuit of innovation, excellence, and diversity, and also the limits of regulation. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. Let me just get the clicker. There we go. Okay, so probably start off by telling you things that you already know extremely well, which is the critical position that higher education has now, not only for the many individuals who benefit from it, but for the wider society and economy. Why regulate? Why get in the way of all of that? The regulatory landscape, how does TEXA help? How are we responding to some of these broader challenges? And what's it going to look like in the future? So attempt to cover that over the next 20 minutes or so. So first of all, higher education key to Australian economy and society, benefits going well beyond the campus. The figures are impressive. As you know, nearly 40 billion in terms of revenue, 2% of Australian GDP. And, perhaps most critically, life-changing education and opportunities for more than 1.5 million students. There was a couple of references yesterday to the fact that Australia is poised to overtake the UK as the second most popular destination for international students. And looking into that research, which came from the Centre for Global Higher Education, possibly based at UCL Derfel, they were actually saying it may already have happened. They were looking at figures 2015, 2016, and of course we're now in 2018. So very, very strong performance in terms of excellence and in terms of the attraction that excellence has for a very large number of international students. So probably don't need to labor the point about the key importance of the sector. So why regulate? Higher education providers historically self-regulated, and I've been in higher education long enough to remember the time when the first stirrings of external regulation were mentioned in the UK, and there was enormous resistance from the academic community, used to a model of self-regulation. So why regulate? Why get in the way? There's a couple of quotes here. One is from Judith Eaton. Accreditors and institutions, she's arguing for the importance of institutional autonomy. Accreditors and institutions are forced to operate in a culture that discourages flexibility and innovation. So regulation actually as a barrier to innovation, as an inhibitor, as something which gets in the way of autonomous institutions pursuing innovation and excellence. You might think that, okay, that's what a vice-chancellor might say. Judith is actually president of the US Council for Higher Education Accreditation. So she's arguing from the point of view of an accreditor, but arguing very strongly for the limits of that accreditation role and saying that there should be strong boundaries around that role. And she contrasts that with the steps that were taken particularly by the Obama administration to strengthen federal accountability for quality and expenditure of federal dollars as well in higher education in the US. The counter-argument, and why has external regulation become a feature of every developed and most developing higher education sectors in the world? Well, from the Universities UK website, effective regulation is essential to provide accountability for public funds, protect the interests of students, and safeguard the reputation of higher education. More provocatively, one of my predecessors as Chief Executive of the Quality Assurance Agency, which is what I was until I came here to TEXA in 2015, John Randall, who was the first CEO of that organization, said the comfortable days are gone the new stakeholding public no longer accepts the legitimacy of unaccountable priesthoods. He was referring there for the need to the academic community to open up to external scrutiny, accountability, and regulation. So you've got there in fairly stark form the poles of that particular debate. The regulatory landscape here, moving closer to Australia, the regulatory landscape in which Texas sits, very much shaped by the Bradley Review, 2008, calling for the sector to permit a diversity of approaches by institutions while encouraging excellence and innovation. A regulatory cycle to assure quality, that sort of fundamental benchmark of any regulatory system, and targets. The government responded in 2009 with a reform package, as you know, and TEXA was then funded in 2010-11 and started work in 2012. Interesting extract here that I just wanted to share quickly from the review. The panel's preference is to establish a national framework which allows progressive change in the structure of the sector to occur over time as institutions and governments respond to emerging trends in the environment. Such a framework should permit a diversity of approaches by institutions while also encouraging excellence, innovation, and accountability. So some key words there which can be found again flowing into the TEXA Act, the legislation that responded to those Bradley recommendations. So the objects of the TEXA Act you have there, perhaps not surprisingly, to regulate on the basis of national consistency, a standard-based framework, then to encourage and promote a system meeting Australia's social and economic needs, to protect students, echoes of John Randall, and to protect and enhance Australia's reputation for quality HE, Australia's international competitiveness, and excellence, diversity, and innovation in higher education in Australia. And you'll recognize those three words as the words we've chosen for the theme of this year's conference, because when we do, as we do frequently within TEXA, look at ourselves and think, how well are we reflecting the objects for which TEXA was established? We ask ourselves, well, regulation, okay, yeah, we can put several ticks there. Protecting students, significant moves, I think, in the way that we're approaching that task in the recent past. But that challenge, do we help, do we promote and enhance diversity, excellence, innovation, or conversely, is there a danger that the regulatory system gets in the way of that? It's a challenge, by the way, not only to TEXA. The TEXA Act established TEXA, but the objects of the TEXA Act apply to the whole regulatory structure. The Higher Education Standards Panel, we'll be hearing from the panel later, and those big bits of architecture, such as the Higher Education Standards Framework, and then beyond that, the provider category standards and the AQF, and again, we'll be hearing more about that later on in today's program. I think it would be true to say that there was a bumpy start to the work of TEXA as a regulator. There was some reference to that yesterday. Kwong Li Dao and Valerie Braithwaite conducted a review. A pleasure again to have Kwong with us in the audience today, and I hope I'm not misquoting anything here. But that review found the headline that the sector had a lot of concerns about the cost of compliance with the regulatory framework that had been established by the TEXA Act and through TEXA. The review found that there was pretty well unanimous agreement that it was really important to have a single body responsible for regulation, but that the approach taken by the agency was causing problems and concern. And particularly that the agency didn't seem to be adhering to its own prescription in the legislation of necessity, risk, and proportionality. And instead, there seemed to be a one-size-fits-all. One-size-fits-all has become almost a cliche in so many areas of discussion, but it's whatever else it is, it's certainly the opposite of diversity. So there was a call in the review, yes, to maintain the control around sector entry, but to be sure that we had a regulatory agency and a regulatory framework that did not stifle innovation, or limit niche providers in preference for larger institutions and universities. And in the circumstances of that time, a clear indication that given the challenges, given the resourcing, TEXA should really focus on its role as a regulator, with providers principally responsible for quality assurance. And by quality assurance, I'm taking that to indicate all those softer but incredibly important values of any regulatory system, which are about enhancement and improvement, continual improvement. And a quote there, best practice and continuous improvement are better delivered by other means, especially those preferred by the providers themselves. So again, an important view there and an important expression of the critical role that the providers themselves play in their own quality assurance and in the quality assurance of the overall system. TEXA was perceived as too top-down, too data-driven, regulating providers as objects, not partners. I think those were the words used. And where it did venture into areas of quality assurance, that was seen to be done in a way that was unlikely to add value. So that was the review relatively early on in TEXA's life, and TEXA is still a young organization. So, sorry, how does TEXA, that's just a moment, let me get back to, there we go. So, how does TEXA help? Given that position and given the criticisms that the sector and the review made at that time, is it ambitious to say that TEXA can actually help in protecting and enhancing innovation, excellence, and diversity? Let me just pull back from another perspective for a moment and focus on the extent to which TEXA itself is innovative. A good regulator could rightly be expected to be innovative, and TEXA was certainly seen in that light when it was established. It has provided a very influential model in the quality assurance and regulation of higher education globally, loathed in some parts of the quality assurance world, maybe for reasons pretty closely associated with the idea that actually quality assurance is something that really is best left to the providers alone, but equally admired and copied by regulatory bodies that were seeking an answer to the increasing challenges of demands for transparency, for clarity of regulatory structure, and a focus on protecting students from the harms posed by poor quality providers in what in many countries of the world are rapidly expanding systems. So that tells us something about the extent to which TEXA's innovative approach, its risk and standard-based approach, the differentiated approach to providers depending on their regulatory profile and history, the strong use made within TEXA of data analysis as the basis for risk assessment, and then moving on from there to an overall assessment of a particular provider. Those were all important, innovative, and are now widely copied features of regulatory systems in other parts of the world. But that still doesn't tell us much about whether TEXA helps innovation, diversity, and excellence out there in the sector. One perspective, the slide, and I think Nick showed this slide at his presentation first thing yesterday morning, or something very close to it. And, you know, looking through those numbers, one would say not a great deal has changed in the years since TEXA's establishment. Higher education providers, reduced by 1. Australian universities, exactly the same number. Ditto, universities of specialization, overseas universities, 170 providers in 2012, 169 providers now. There's been churn, absolutely. Some providers have left the system, some providers have joined the system. Of the providers joining the system, many are specializing in a particular subject area of business and commerce. Questions around diversity of subject, diversity of types of institutions, certainly diversity in terms of categories doesn't seem to be a particularly strong feature of the system that's unfolded since the passing of the TEXA Act. Glyn Davis, as many of you will know, in his recent book, The Australian Idea of a University, questioned the very notion of the diversity of the Australian sector, arguing that Australian HE is dominated by autonomous, professional, comprehensive, secular, public and commuter universities sharing very similar missions. So will this pattern change, and what role might the regulatory architecture play? The wider regulatory architecture is in motion, as it often is, but particularly perhaps so at the moment. We've had the review of the TEXA Act published earlier this week, and helpfully reminded by Stephen Matchett this morning that it took place during the War of the Bavarian Succession and has now reported. But it has reported, and it's reported very positively in terms of not only of those who conducted the review, but those in the sector that they spoke to. Higher education sector has positive views of the regulatory system established by the TEXA Act and by TEXA as a regulator. The move to a single national regulator has delivered benefits which the sector itself has recognised in reduced compliance burden, improved consistency, stakeholder confidence in the quality of Australian HE, particularly from international students, and that slide earlier on bears that out, and the engagement that TEXA now has with the sector and with stakeholders. There will be some recommendations and amendments. The Australian qualifications framework is to be reviewed. The provider category standards are to be reviewed. And we have a presentation and a session later on in the programme about that, so I'm not going to say any more about those two aspects at the moment. What effect will these changes have on the sector? Will they assist with further progress in higher education, better meeting the needs of society? Again, you'll remember one of the objects of the TEXA Act. Will there be a priority as these reviews play out in diversity and innovation? Let me say something more about how TEXA has responded to some of those challenges and to the need to not only to regulate, but to support and encourage diversity and innovation, and to do that through engagement, to do that through an approach which is described in the review that took place in 2013 as an approach of partnership rather than regulation of objects. Engagement with sector has been extremely important to us, with the sector, with stakeholders, and with students. At a time of tough resourcing, and Nick touched on some of the dimensions of that yesterday, TEXA has established an engagement group, a very tangible sign of our commitment to the partnership approach. You heard from several members yesterday of the Student Expert Advisory Group, and Derfel is going to be speaking to us in a moment about student engagement. Their voices, up here on the platform, diverse, inclusive, student-centered, was what was coming across very strongly in the voices expressed on the platform yesterday, but also voices that are now regularly meeting with the TEXA commissioners and ensuring that those voices are being heard at the highest decision-making level in TEXA and are helping to shape the way in which we review and conceptualize our assessment task and the places that we see for greater student involvement at the various stages of our assessment. And that's work that the group was engaged with on Monday of this week. We had an eloquent plea yesterday from one of our keynote speakers for an engagement with professional accreditation bodies that encourages rather than stifles innovation. And again, TEXA has picked up that challenge with MOUs now with over 25 professional accreditation bodies and a forum coming up with our professional accreditation partners in the middle of next month. Our guidance is appreciated. We know that from the surveys that we conduct as part of our regulator performance framework. There is indeed, there are pleas for more guidance and more wide-ranging guidance, which we're listening to. They get very, very high ratings in the provider survey. The good practice notes, we took a step of producing a good practice note in relation to academic integrity. There will be more of those good practice notes, ways in which we can help the sector, not to tell the sector what good practice is, but to reflect back to the sector those examples of good practice that we find in our work and in dialogue and partnership. So partnerships with professional accreditation bodies, Partnerships with those concerned with teaching and learning. We heard yesterday from Alison Johns of Advance HE, a UK body, but a UK body with over 2,000 now fellows here in Australia, and therefore one that we're engaging with in terms of the quality assurance issues around teaching and learning. And we're also partnering strongly with other regulatory bodies, ASQA, AITSL, and making sure that there's joined-upness, that wherever possible duplication is being avoided, and that there is appropriate exchange of regulatory intelligence. We're also helping to address sector-wide issues, and I thought I'd share this with you. This was, I think, almost in an act of deliberate provocation. A contract cheating company put this poster up on a lamppost on the corner of King and Collins at the back of the TEXA offices, and it was spotted by one of our members of staff who took a photograph of it. So there you go. Assessments, case studies, research writing, programming of any subject, any course. We'll get it done at a low price and on time and with good quality, and you can't always say that about your own work. So, academic integrity remains a key area, and it's one in which we're going to be very active over the coming period, and it's one in which we're learning also from the very vigorous efforts of some of our international partners, and I'll come on to them in a moment, in combating the increasingly sophisticated approaches that there are to academic integrity. The incredibly sensitive, difficult, and problematic issue of sexual assault and sexual harassment on campus. We're involved with that in terms of providing an overview, which we will supply to the Minister, of what's going on across the whole sector, universities and the non-university parts of the sector. Admissions transparency, work which is now well underway, and it was great to see recently the launch of the Course Seeker website as another expression of the work that's been done in admissions transparency. And in all of these areas, we're working in partnership with government, with providers, with stakeholders, with experts, to try and get overall a picture of what's going on, and then work out ways in which we can apply that in our regulatory work, either in individual cases which require regulatory intervention, or more generally in helping to disseminate the evidence. And there's a lot of evidence in these areas of good practice and serious steps being taken to counter these particular problems. So, and I need to draw to a close, more development in our approach over the coming period. More transparency, more accountability, more resources for the sector. Publishing more information about our decisions is something that we've taken strong steps on recently. They're now published sooner. We actually draw more attention to them and make sure that we don't just rely on people who in an idle moment decide to scroll through the National Register to see whether anything's changed. I wouldn't recommend that as the way of finding out that kind of information. So we publish information. We publish information about unsuccessful applications as well as the successful ones. We try to give back to the sector the insights that we've derived from our assessment work in the form, for instance, of publications like Key Financial Metrics and Assessment Insights published recently, which gave a very clear indication of where we see the patterns of risk and difficulty within the sector, and conversely, where we see signs which are encouraging. We make public statements in the cases of providers that, for one reason or another, have ceased to operate, and we play a role in advising the many students who contact us from those institutions to find out what's happening, to find out what's going to be happening to their records as their provider has closed. We have recently, and this was mentioned yesterday, extended registration periods for a number of providers, and that will continue. That's an illustration of a continuing commitment from the agency to review the way in which we operate, to continue to streamline, to continue to make sure that we are resting very lightly, as lightly as is compatible with confidence on those providers who consistently demonstrate low risk. Maybe that was... So that's some of the shape of what we're doing. We've heard the message from our providers about the need to rebuild and redevelop our case management structure, much valued, a wish to make sure that there is someone at TEXA, a team of people who know you as a provider, understand you, have got familiarity with the case that is under assessment and can communicate with you regularly. And particularly a key point, a very clear message that providers would appreciate more face-to-face engagement, more presence on campuses and sites from Texas staff. And we're certainly looking, as we rebuild our staffing capacity in the light of the situation Nick was describing yesterday, we're attentive to that. Regulatory innovation through partnership, and I did want to mention this. Sorry, let me move on to the next slide. Regulatory innovation through partnership, and particularly because some of them are represented here today, I did want to mention the fact that we continue as an agency to work in close partnership with regulatory bodies and quality assurance agencies in other countries. Brandon Lee is here from CPE in Singapore. We've been looking at what Brandon's done in terms of the GradBot online bot, helping students choose courses and next steps. We've been listening recently to what our colleagues in Dubai at the Knowledge and Human Development Authority are doing about how regulation, believe it or not, can also help with creativity, happiness, and innovation. We've been very influenced, and I won't steal any of Derfl's thunder, by work that QAA did around championing student engagement in quality assurance and enhancement. And earlier this week at the Forum on Online Learning, we heard from Grant Clinkham of NZQA about the way in which his organisation is incorporating micro-credentials, and particularly how that can be done in a way that allows them to flourish and doesn't inhibit a type of qualification which is a challenge to traditional regulation. So, and these are my final points, over the coming year and beyond, increased engagement with the sector, continuing to act as a focus for thought leadership, not least through this conference and through the forums that we're holding now regularly throughout the year, to continue to strengthen and diversify our expert body to make sure that that expert body, those who assist us with reaching a view, particularly about courses, represents the whole sector that we regulate, meeting the demand which we've clearly heard for more guidance, but, and I'll finish on a note that the Chief Commissioner struck yesterday, keeping very focused on the core, on the fact that with a major investment in our staff who are conducting assessments, we will drive to reduce assessment times, because ultimately that rapidity of turnaround is a way in which we can help the real sources of innovation, which are the providers themselves, to do that work as effectively as possible and to fulfill the objects that were set out back in 2012 when the Texas Act was passed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Anthony. Anthony's the boss, so you don't take the boss off stage, even when they're 10 minutes over time. Consequently, we're going to keep it tight with questions, but you will have the opportunity to ask all the Texas staff all the questions you want at lunchtime today. So if you have got a burning question and it doesn't get answered now, there's plenty of time over lunch. All right. In order to promote diversity, should Texas be using more diverse data sets to make their decisions? What about this one-size-fits-all versus one-size-fits particular universities?
So I think probably two aspects to that in particular. One is that we do keep the risk indicators and the risk assessment framework under regular review. And I mean by regular, I mean every year there is a detailed report on the way in which goes to the Commission, which is a report on the way in which the risk assessment framework has worked. We look at the indicators, we look at whether the indicators are continuing to give us effective differential information about providers. We ask whether some indicators have become redundant, and we are asking whether in some cases it might be appropriate to have indicators which vary according to context. We're also asking, I ought to add, on the grounds of transparency, whether we ought to publish more information about the indicators and about the thresholds. So that's currently under discussion.
I think this was an interesting one because it's quite broad and might not come up at lunch, which is around Texas' role in major debates, for example, the one the government's about to have around free speech in higher education.
For us, when it comes to those major debates about those sector-wide issues, first of all, the sector-wide issues are important, and they keep arising, and they're often relevant because they affect all providers, even those providers that are in our terms low risk. For us, the touchstone is always what is the connection with the standards. So for instance, if you take freedom of speech as a current topic, for us, the question is, how does that link to the obligation that providers have under the standards framework for freedom of intellectual inquiry? And how do providers balance that with other obligations they have under the framework for issues like the well-being and safety of students? So the link back to the standards is critical in working out what's the TEXA interest and perspective here, rather than feeling we have to say something about every aspect of every problem.
I like this because this person who's written this question has put some effort into the metaphor. Are vanilla-flavoured Australian universities, and we might argue providers more generally, a consequence of TEXA regulation, or can TEXA actually help create more flavours?
Look, I think TEXA has an obligation to make sure that we fully understand, appreciate and value the many different kinds of providers that are regulated within the Australian sector. So, you know, the 120, 130 odd that aren't the 40 universities. That's important, and in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're really listening to what those providers are saying to us as individual providers and what they're saying to us through their peak bodies, for example. And we have a view from the peaks coming up. It means that it's very important that we reflect on the composition of our staff. Do we have staff who have experience of those sectors, of those parts of the sector? Do we have subject experts who are drawn from that part of the sector? Beyond that, we have to go slightly further, and that's where it comes back to the point about the TEXA Act, not just creating TEXA, but creating an entire regulatory environment. And some of the elements of the regulatory environment, TEXA works within and works to, but they're certainly not owned by TEXA or the responsibility of TEXA.
Last one, and again, this is one that plays to some of the bigger issues that are going on around governance in Australia. How might TEXA and the higher education sector more broadly learn from the Banking Royal Commission, for example?
Absolutely. You know, the point that I think was actually affirmed in the Braithwaite Howe report, which is, you know, talk about quality assurance, talk about how it's done, but, you know, don't lose sight of the fundamental importance of good, strong regulation, because actually, if you get that wrong in any sector, the entire sector suffers, even the good ones. And the collapse of public trust and public confidence, you know, we could talk a lot longer about how that is affecting so many institutions here and in many other countries at the moment. If that goes, it takes a very, very long time to get it back.
There's a specific question in here as well, though, because so many members of the governance instruments of universities and higher education providers are drawn from the banking and financial sectors. Is there something here that TEXA may want to look at?
Look, I think that I just want to use that to give possibly the first plug for a forum that we'll be conducting on the importance of governance. No, seriously, governance. If you look at the insights from assessment that we published, governance is the key issue. Getting governance right and getting the balance between corporate governance and academic governance and management and the executive right is absolutely key.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please thank Anthony.
Thanks.